I sat in the cold conference room of Whitman and Associates, my hands folded calmly on the polished mahogany table, watching my soon-to-be ex-husband Brandon pace near the windows like a caged predator. He looked confident, almost smug, dressed in his expensive suit with his attorney, Charles Brenner, seated beside him reviewing documents. Brandon had always underestimated me during our 12-year marriage, treating me like I was fragile, naive, someone who needed protecting from the complexities of the world. He'd managed all our finances, made all major decisions, and consistently dismissed my opinions as cute but ultimately irrelevant. When I'd finally asked for a divorce 3 months ago, he'd laughed, and told me I'd regret leaving him, that I had no idea how to survive on my own, that I'd come crawling back within weeks. Now we were here for our final settlement conference, and Brandon clearly believed he held all the cards. His attorney had submitted a proposal that was insulting in its arrogance. I would receive minimal spousal support for just 2 years, none of our investment assets, and only my personal belongings from our house. Brandon would keep our home in Lincoln Park, valued at $2 million, his business interests, all investment accounts, and the vacation property in Colorado. He generously offered to let me keep my 12-year-old Honda and my personal jewelry, items that were mine anyway. "Shall we begin?" asked the mediator, a professional woman named Patricia Hoffman, who'd been assigned to facilitate our settlement discussion. Brandon sat down with exaggerated casualness, draping his arm over the back of his chair. "Let's get this over with. I have a meeting at 4. Charles Brenner opened his briefcase and pulled out documents. "We believe our proposal is fair given the circumstances of the marriage. My client was the primary breadwinner throughout the relationship, and Mrs. Hayes made minimal financial contributions." Mrs. Hayes. I'd kept my maiden name, Sterling, throughout our marriage, but Brandon's attorney persisted in calling me by Brandon's surname as a subtle power play. My attorney, Catherine Mendoza, hadn't arrived yet. She'd texted 15 minutes ago saying she was running late and to start without her. Brandon had smirked when I'd read that text aloud, clearly interpreting it as a sign that even my lawyer didn't take this seriously. "Perhaps we should wait for Miss Sterling's counsel," Patricia suggested diplomatically. "Oh, let's just move forward," Brandon said dismissively. "Sophia doesn't really need a lawyer for this. The settlement is straightforward. I keep what I built, she gets enough to start over. Clean, simple, fair." He looked at me with what he probably thought was kindness. "Sophie, you know I'm being generous here. You haven't worked in 8 years. You have no significant income or assets of your own. Fighting this will just waste money on legal fees you can't afford." This was the moment he expected me to crumble, to accept his terms out of fear or exhaustion or sheer lack of options. This was the moment I'd been preparing for during 3 months of careful planning. "Actually, Brandon," I said calmly, "I think we should wait for Catherine. She has some information you'll want to hear." Something flickered across his face, annoyance, maybe a hint of uncertainty. But it passed quickly, replaced by his usual arrogant confidence. "Fine, we'll wait 10 minutes. Then we're moving forward, with or without your attorney." Those 10 minutes felt eternal. Brandon made small talk with Charles about golf and market trends. Patricia reviewed her notes. I sat quietly, maintaining the appearance of the meek, overwhelmed wife Brandon expected me to be. Exactly 9 minutes later, the conference room door opened, and Catherine Mendoza entered. She was a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back severely and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd come highly recommended by a friend who'd gone through a difficult divorce, and our first meeting had convinced me she was exactly who I needed. "Apologies for my tardiness," Catherine said, setting down her leather briefcase and removing her coat. "I was collecting some final documentation that's relevant to our discussion today." She pulled out a thick folder and set it on the table with a satisfying thud. Brandon glanced at it with mild curiosity but no real concern. "Miss Sterling has reviewed the settlement proposal submitted by Mr. Hayes's counsel," Catherine began, her voice professional and cool. "We find it unacceptable and will be submitting a counter-proposal that more accurately reflects the marital assets and their appropriate division." Charles Brenner leaned forward. Excuse me, Miss Sterling. hasn't been employed in 8 years and made no financial contributions to the household. Our proposal already offers more spousal support than strictly required by Illinois law. Catherine smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. That's an interesting interpretation of no financial contributions. Shall we discuss what Miss Sterling actually contributed to this marriage? She opened the folder and pulled out the first document. Let's start with Mr. Hayes's business, Hayes Consulting Group. The company was founded 11 years ago, 1 year into the marriage, with significant startup capital. Mr. Hayes, can you tell us where that startup capital came from? Brandon shifted slightly. From savings and a small business loan. Actually, Catherine said, sliding a document across the table, the startup capital was $75,000 from Miss Sterling's inheritance from her grandmother, plus an additional $25,000 from her personal savings accumulated before the marriage. These funds were deposited directly into the business account, as documented here. I watched Brandon's face carefully. He hadn't expected this. He'd somehow convinced himself over the years that the money he'd used to start his company had been his own, conveniently forgetting where it had actually originated. That was a gift, Brandon said quickly. Sophie gave me that money to pursue my dream. A gift? Catherine repeated. Do you have any documentation showing this was a gift rather than a marital investment? Any written agreement? Any evidence Miss Sterling intended to relinquish all rights to those funds? Silence. Charles Brenner was now looking at his client with questions in his eyes. Brandon clearly hadn't mentioned this detail to his attorney. The business was started during the marriage using marital funds, Catherine continued. Which means it's a marital asset subject to equitable division, regardless of who actively managed it. Hayes Consulting Group is currently valued at approximately $8 million. Miss Sterling is entitled to an equitable share of that value. Brandon's confident expression was cracking. That's ridiculous. I built that business. Sophie had nothing to do with it after the initial investment. Actually, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since Catherine arrived, I had quite a bit to do with it. For the first 3 years, I managed all your administrative work, bookkeeping, client communications, and scheduling. I worked 40 hours a week for no pay, while you built client relationships and developed the business model. Catherine pulled out more documents. We have emails, calendars, and testimony from early clients confirming Miss Sterling's substantial role in the company's foundational years. In Illinois, such contributions are absolutely considered when determining equitable division of marital assets. She looked directly at Brandon. So let's establish the first fact. Hayes Consulting Group is a marital asset, started with Miss Sterling's funds, and built partially through her unpaid labor. She's entitled to a significant share of its current value. Brandon's attorney was now taking frantic notes, clearly realizing his client had provided incomplete information. But Catherine wasn't done. Let's move on to the investment accounts, she continued, pulling out another stack of documents. Mr. Hayes's proposal suggests he should retain all investment assets, which currently total approximately $3 million. He's characterized these as his separate property, earned through his income. Is that correct, Mr. Brenner? Charles nodded cautiously. That's our position, yes. Interesting, Catherine said, because these investment accounts were funded through Hayes Consulting Group profits. Profits from a business that, as we've just established, is marital property. Additionally, several of these investments were made based on research and recommendations provided by Miss Sterling, who has an MBA in finance from Northwestern. Brandon actually laughed at that. Sophie has a degree in finance? Since when? I met his eyes, steadily. Since before we met, Brandon. You never asked about my education because you assumed I hadn't gone to college. I have both a bachelor's and master's degree in finance from Northwestern. I graduated summa cum laude. The shock on his face was almost comical. In 12 years of marriage, he'd never once asked about my educational background, simply assuming I'd been a secretary or something similar before we met. During our marriage, I continued, I analyzed all our investment opportunities, researched companies, and provided detailed recommendations that you then presented as your own financial savvy. The tech stocks that tripled in value? My research. The real estate investment trust that's been performing so well? My recommendation. The portfolio diversification strategy that protected us during the last market downturn? My planning. Catherine laid out printed emails dating back years, showing my detailed investment analyses sent to Brandon with subject lines like, recommendation for Q3 portfolio adjustment, and analysis of emerging tech sector opportunities. Brandon's face had gone pale. He'd truly believed he'd made all those investment decisions himself, completely forgetting that I'd been the one doing the research and analysis behind the scenes. So the investment accounts, Catherine said, were not only funded by marital assets but also grew substantially due to Miss Sterling's financial expertise. These are unquestionably marital properties subject to division. Charles Brenner cleared his throat. Even so, a 50-50 split would be excessive given that Mr. Hayes was the one actively earning income. About that, Catherine said, and her smile became predatory. Let's discuss Mr. Hayes's income and how it was actually earned. She pulled out yet another folder. Shall we talk about the tax returns, Mr. Hayes? Brandon's expression shifted from shocked to genuinely worried. What about them? For the past 8 years, Catherine said, you've claimed Miss Sterling as a dependent on your tax returns, receiving significant tax benefits from that status. However, you've also classified certain household expenses as business expenses, claiming a home office deduction. She spread out tax returns across the table. The problem is, you can't have it both ways, either. Sterling was providing valuable services to your business from your home, which would make her entitled to compensation and/or equity. Or, she was genuinely a dependent who provided no services, in which case your home office deductions are fraudulent. Charles Brenner's face had gone ashen. Tax fraud was serious, and Catherine had just laid out evidence suggesting Brandon had been improperly claiming deductions for years. We didn't file fraudulent returns, Brandon protested. My accountant. Your accountant prepared returns based on information you provided, Catherine interrupted. Information that was, at best, misleading. The IRS tends to take a dim view of people who claim their spouse is both a dependent and an unpaid business contributor for tax advantage purposes. She let that sink in before continuing. Now, Miss Sterling has no desire to report these irregularities to the IRS. That would hurt both parties and serve no productive purpose. However, Catherine said meaningfully, these tax irregularities do demonstrate a pattern of Mr. Hayes benefiting financially from Miss Sterling's work while simultaneously minimizing her contributions. That pattern is relevant to determining an equitable settlement. Patricia, the mediator, spoke up for the first time in a while. Perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow both parties to consult with their attorneys privately? Not yet, Catherine said. We're not finished. We still need to discuss the house in Lincoln Park and the Colorado property. Brandon recovered some of his composure. The house is in my name only. I purchased it before we were married. You purchased it 2 months before your wedding, Catherine corrected, using a down payment that included, surprise, another $20,000 from Miss Sterling's premarital savings. We have bank records showing the transfer. And the house, like the business, appreciated substantially during the marriage due to improvements funded by marital income. She pulled out property records and home improvement receipts, totaling over $300,000. Improvements Miss Sterling often planned, managed, and in some cases physically worked on. I have photographs of her painting, gardening, renovating the kitchen, all sweat equity that contributed to the property's current value. Brandon tried to interrupt, but Catherine wasn't finished. The Colorado property was purchased 5 years ago, titled in both names, so that's clearly marital property. But I think we should also discuss what else was purchased during your marriage. She pulled out credit card statements and receipts. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Hayes has made some interesting purchases. A luxury car titled solely in his name, $58,000. A boat also solely in his name, $72,000. Expensive watches, golf club memberships, skiing equipment, all purchased with marital funds but treated as his separate property. Catherine looked at Brandon directly. You've been systematically converting marital assets into items titled in your name alone, while simultaneously portraying your wife as financially dependent and contributing nothing. That's not only inequitable, its potentially fraudulent conversion of marital property. The room was absolutely silent. Brandon's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by something that looked like panic. Charles Brenner was frantically reviewing the documents Catherine had provided, clearly realizing his client had grossly misrepresented the situation. "So here's what we're going to propose," Catherine said, pulling out a document labeled Counter-Proposal for Marital Settlement. "Miss Sterling will receive 50% equity in Hayes Consulting Group, which she may choose to retain as a shareholder or liquidate through buyout. She will receive 50% of all investment accounts, retirement funds, and other financial assets acquired during the marriage. She will receive the Colorado property outright, while Mr. Hayes retains the Lincoln Park house, but he will buy out her equity stake in that property, valued at approximately $400,000 based on current market value minus remaining mortgage." Catherine continued reading the terms. She will receive spousal support of $8,000 monthly for 5 years while she re-establishes her career, plus $50,000 in immediate payment to cover transitional expenses and attorney fees. And Mr. Hayes will refinance or sell assets as necessary to fund the buyout of Miss Sterling's business equity, estimated at $4 million. Brandon shot to his feet. $4 million? That's insane. I don't have that kind of liquidity. "Then you'll need to arrange financing or negotiate a payment structure," Catherine said calmly. "But Miss Sterling is entitled to her equitable share of marital assets, which this proposal reflects. Alternatively, she can retain her 50% ownership stake in Hayes Consulting Group and participate actively in management and decision-making going forward." The thought of me being his business partner clearly horrified Brandon. "You can't just waltz in and take half my company." "It's not your company," I said firmly, finding my voice and my strength. "It's our company. Built with my money, my labor, my expertise, and marital funds." I stood up, facing him directly. "For 12 years, you've treated me like I was weak, stupid, someone who needed you to make all the decisions and handle all the complicated things because I couldn't possibly understand. You made me feel small and dependent, while you took credit for everything I contributed." My voice was steady, stronger than it had been in years. "You forgot that I had a life, an education, and skills before you. You forgot that I gave up a promising career in finance to support your dreams. You forgot where your startup money came from and who managed your business in the early years. Or maybe you didn't forget, maybe you just didn't care, because it was convenient to pretend I was nothing more than a dependent housewife." Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. "I asked you for a divorce because I finally realized I'd spent 12 years making myself smaller so you could feel bigger. I'd hidden my intelligence, downplayed my contributions, and let you take credit for my work because I thought that's what marriage required. Sacrifice and support." I looked at Catherine, then back at Brandon. "But I'm done being small. I'm done pretending I didn't build that business with you. I'm done letting you characterize 12 years of unpaid labor, financial expertise, and sweat equity as minimal contributions. So yes, I'm taking half, because half is what I earned." The silence that followed was profound. Patricia, the mediator, looked at Brandon with something like pity. "Mr. Hayes, perhaps now would be a good time for that recess so you can consult with your attorney." Brandon and Charles left the room, Brandon looking shell-shocked and furious. Once they were gone, Catherine turned to me with a slight smile. "You did well. How do you feel?" "Stronger than I have in years," I admitted. "I didn't realize how much of myself I'd given up until I started fighting to get it back." Catherine nodded. "That's common in relationships with power imbalances. One person gradually becomes smaller while the other grows larger, until the imbalance seems normal, even natural." She organized her documents efficiently. Brandon's attorney will likely advise him to negotiate rather than go to trial. Everything we presented today is documented and defensible. A judge would probably award you even more than our proposal, especially given the tax irregularities and systematic conversion of marital assets." "What if he refuses?" I asked. "What if he decides to fight this in court?" "Then we fight," Catherine said simply. "And we win. You have evidence, documentation, and a compelling narrative. Brandon has arrogance and the mistaken belief that being the breadwinner entitles him to everything. That's not how marital property law works in Illinois. The recess lasted 45 minutes. When Brandon and Charles returned, Brandon's expression was carefully neutral, but his earlier smugness was completely gone. Charles looked like a man who'd just had a very difficult conversation with his client. "We'd like to discuss a modified proposal," Charles began diplomatically. "My client acknowledges that perhaps our initial offer didn't fully reflect Miss Sterling's contributions to the marital estate." Brandon shot him a look that could have killed, but Charles continued. "However, we feel that a 50% equity stake in Hayes Consulting Group is excessive. We'd like to propose a buyout of 30% equity for $2.4 million, plus retain the investment account division and property terms Miss Mendoza outlined." Catherine didn't even pause. 45% equity or $3.6 million buyout. And Mr. Hayes will sign a written acknowledgement of Miss Sterling's founding role in Hayes Consulting Group, suitable for publication, documenting her financial and operational contributions to the business for the first 3 years. Brandon's face flushed with anger. "You want me to publicly admit that your wife was a business partner and financial expert who contributed significantly to your success?" Catherine interrupted. "Yes, that's exactly what we want, because it's the truth, and Miss Sterling deserves recognition for her work." I watched Brandon struggle with his ego and his financial reality. His company was his identity, the proof of his brilliance and hard work. Admitting that I'd been essential to its founding and growth would shatter the narrative he'd built about himself. But $4 million was a lot of money to pay for pride. "I need time to think about this," Brandon finally said. "We all need to take a step back and approach this reasonably." "You have 72 hours, Catherine said. "After that, we file for trial and submit our complete evidence package to the court, including the tax irregularities. We'll also be deposing your accountant and early business associates about Miss Sterling's role in Hayes Consulting Group." She stood, gathering her materials. "Think carefully about whether you want your business dealings, tax returns, and the true story of your company's founding examined in public court proceedings, or whether you'd prefer to settle this privately and move forward." We left Brandon and Charles sitting in the conference room, both looking significantly less confident than they had 2 hours earlier. In the parking garage, Catherine turned to me. "Are you prepared for him to fight this? Because he might. Pride makes people do irrational things." "Let him fight," I said with certainty. "I spent 12 years being the person he wanted me to be. Quiet, supportive, invisible. I'm not that person anymore." The 72 hours crawled by. I spent them at my friend Naomi's apartment, where I'd been staying since leaving Brandon 3 months ago. Naomi had been supportive throughout everything, listening to me process years of feeling diminished and helping me recognize patterns I'd been too close to see. "You know what's wild?" I said to her the evening after the mediation session. "I genuinely forgot I had an MBA. Not literally forgot, but I'd pushed it so far down, made it so irrelevant to my daily life, that when Brandon laughed at the idea, my first instinct was almost to apologize for bringing it up." Naomi shook her head. "That's what he did to you, systematically made you doubt yourself until you forgot who you were before him." She was right. When Brandon and I met 13 years ago, I'd been a confident financial analyst at a consulting firm, considering offers from 2 major investment banks. I'd been ambitious, capable, and fully aware of my worth. But Brandon had gradually reshaped me. His constant subtle dismissals of my opinions and decisions slowly eroding my confidence, until I'd started to believe maybe I didn't understand things as well as I thought. Maybe I wasn't as smart as I'd believed. Maybe I needed him to guide me through the complexities of adult life. It had been insidious, the way he'd diminished me. Never through overt cruelty or obvious abuse, but through 1,000 small moments of dismissing my input, explaining things I already understood, making decisions without consulting me, and treating my contributions as inconsequential. I'd given up my career to support his business, but it had been framed as him taking care of me, rather than me making a sacrifice for our joint future. When I'd researched investments and provided analysis, he'd acted like I was being helpful rather than providing expert financial guidance. When I'd managed his business operations, he'd treated it as me helping out rather than working a full-time unpaid job. The more I'd let him minimize my contributions, the more I'd started to believe his version of reality. That I was lucky to have him. That he was the successful one, that my role was simply to support his achievements. Getting that back, reclaiming my sense of self-worth and capability, had been the hardest part of leaving. Catherine's presentation in the mediation had forced Brandon to confront the reality he'd been denying, that I wasn't weak, wasn't ignorant, wasn't lucky to have him. That in fact, he'd been lucky to have me, and he'd squandered that luck by treating me with contempt. On the third day, Catherine called. Brandon's attorney just contacted me. They want to settle. Brandon will agree to the 45% equity buyout for $3.6 million, payable in 3 installments over 18 months. He'll also agree to the property division, investment account split, and spousal support terms. I felt a surge of victory mixed with something more complicated sadness, maybe, for the years I'd wasted with someone who'd never truly seen me. What about the written acknowledgement? I asked. Catherine paused. That's the sticking point. He's refusing to sign any public statement about your role in founding Hayes Consulting Group. His ego won't allow it. I thought about that. The acknowledgement would have been satisfying, would have corrected the public record, and given me credit I deserved. But did I really need Brandon's words to validate what I knew to be true? Let it go, I said. I don't need him to acknowledge my contributions publicly. I know what I did. The people who matter know what I did, and he'll have to live with the knowledge that he's paying me $3.6 million because he can't deny it privately, even if he won't admit it publicly. Are you sure? Catherine asked. We can push for it. We have the leverage. I'm sure, I said, firmly. I don't want anything from Brandon except what I'm legally entitled to, and the freedom to rebuild my life without him. His acknowledgement isn't part of that. We finalized the settlement within a week. Brandon signed the papers with barely concealed resentment, his jaw tight as he committed to paying me $3.6 million over 18 months, dividing our assets, and providing 5 years of spousal support. The day the settlement became official, I stood outside the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in over a decade. Catherine had walked out with me, and we'd paused on the steps. What will you do now? She'd asked. I'm going back to finance, I said. I've already been in contact with several firms. Turns out a Northwestern MBA doesn't expire, even if you don't use it for 8 years. And I've spent the past few months updating my knowledge, taking online courses, networking. I smiled, and it was genuine. I'm not the same person I was 13 years ago when I left my career. I'm better. I understand things about resilience and self-worth that I never would have learned if Brandon hadn't tried to make me small. 6 months after the settlement, I accepted a position as a senior financial analyst at Preston Capital, a respected investment firm. My starting salary was $200,000, more than I'd been making when I left finance 8 years earlier. My first day back in an office environment was surreal. I'd spent so long being the invisible support system for Brandon's success that actually being the person whose expertise was valued, whose recommendations were implemented, whose name was on reports and presentations, felt almost foreign. But it also felt right, like putting on clothes that finally fit after years of wearing things too small. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Brandon had struggled to raise the capital for my buyout payments. He'd had to take out substantial loans against Hayes Consulting Group, and the debt service was affecting the company's cash flow. I felt no sympathy. He'd had the option to let me retain equity and become an active business partner, but his ego wouldn't allow it. Now he was paying for that ego, literally. The first installment of my buyout, $1.2 million, hit my account 3 months after the settlement. I used part of it to purchase a beautiful condo in Wicker Park, smaller than the Lincoln Park house but entirely mine, filled with furniture I chose and decorated in a style I loved. I used another portion to invest in a diverse portfolio of stocks and bonds, investments I researched and selected myself, applying the financial expertise I'd always had, but Brandon had minimized. The satisfaction of making those decisions independently, of watching my investments grow through my own skill and knowledge, was profound. A year after leaving Brandon, I attended a finance industry event and ran into someone who'd been an early client of Hayes Consulting Group. William Tremont was now a senior executive at a major corporation, and he recognized me immediately. "Sophia Sterling. I haven't seen you in years. How are you?" We talked for a while, catching up on careers and lives. Eventually, William said, I always wondered what happened to you. In those early days of Hayes Consulting, you were the one I really dealt with. Brandon would show up for meetings, but you were the one doing the analysis, sending the reports, actually solving our problems." He shook his head. "Then suddenly you weren't there anymore, and the quality of work declined noticeably. Brandon claimed you'd moved on to other opportunities, but the company was never quite as sharp after you left." "I didn't leave," I admitted. "I just became invisible. I was still doing the work, but Brandon stopped acknowledging it was me doing it." William looked genuinely upset. "That's terrible, and frankly, stupid on his part. You had real talent." He pulled out a business card. "We're looking for someone to head up our financial strategy division. Would you be interested in discussing it?" That conversation led to a job offer 3 weeks later, a position as Director of Financial Strategy at Tremont Industries, with a salary of $350,000 plus equity. It was the kind of role I'd once dreamed of having, the career trajectory I'd abandoned to support Brandon's dreams. I accepted immediately. When Brandon heard about my new position, news traveled fast in Chicago's business community. He called me for the first time since our settlement had finalized. "You took a job at Tremont?" he asked without preamble. "That's a direct competitor to Hayes Consulting. I could argue that violates our settlement agreement." "Our settlement agreement has no non-compete clause," I replied calmly. "Your attorney should have included one, if that was a concern. And Tremont Industries isn't a direct competitor. They're a potential client, though I doubt they'll be hiring Hayes Consulting anytime soon." I could hear his frustration through the phone. "You're doing this to hurt me, to damage my business." "I'm doing this because I'm good at my job and someone recognized that," I corrected. "Brandon, not everything is about you. My career isn't some vendetta against yours. It's just my career, built on my skills and my expertise." He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I didn't realize. Back then, I didn't realize how much you contributed, how smart you were. I thought I was protecting you, taking care of you." "You thought I was weak," I said. "You saw someone you could mold into supporting your ambitions, and you convinced yourself that was love, that was partnership." I paused, choosing my words carefully. "I don't hate you, Brandon, but I don't need you either, or it turns out that's what you could never accept, that I might be fine, might even be better, without you." He hung up without saying goodbye. I never heard from him again. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I was promoted to Vice President of Strategic Finance at Tremont Industries. My team had successfully guided 3 major acquisitions, restructured our investment portfolio to increase returns by 30%, and position the company as a leader in sustainable business practices. I was respected, valued, and compensated appropriately for my expertise. I'd also started dating someone new, Alexander, a high school teacher, who thought my intelligence was attractive rather than threatening, who asked my opinion and actually listened to my answers, who treated me like an equal partner rather than a dependent. The relationship was still new, still tentative, but it was built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation for each other's strengths. Nothing like what I'd had with Brandon. One afternoon, I was having coffee with Catherine Mendoza, who'd become a friend beyond just being my attorney. We were discussing a case she was working on, another woman in a marriage where she'd been systematically minimized. "It's so common," Catherine said sadly. "Smart, capable women who gradually convince themselves they're less than they are because their partners need them to be smaller." She looked at me seriously. "You were lucky, not because of the money, though that helped, but because you found your strength again before it was too late. Some women never do." I thought about that. about the version of myself who'd sat in that conference room 18 months ago, nervous and uncertain, worried that maybe Brandon was right, maybe I couldn't survive without him, about how Catherine's presentation had been a mirror showing me who I'd actually always been. Capable, intelligent, strong. He thought I was weak, I said quietly, until the lawyer spoke. Until you forced him to confront evidence he couldn't deny, numbers he couldn't manipulate, documentation of contributions he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Catherine smiled. I just presented the facts. You're the one who'd been strong all along. You just needed someone to remind you. As I walked back to my office that afternoon, I thought about Brandon's face when Catherine had laid out my education, my contributions, my financial expertise, all the things he'd either forgotten or deliberately ignored, the shock, the disbelief, the slow realization that he'd completely underestimated the woman he'd been married to for 12 years. He'd thought I was weak because I'd made myself small to fit into his vision of what I should be. But weakness and smallness aren't the same thing. I'd been compressed, diminished, contained, but never actually weak. And the moment I decided to stop making myself small to reclaim the space I deserved, all that hidden strength had flooded back. Brandon had learned a costly lesson, that underestimating someone doesn't make them less capable. It just makes you less prepared for when they finally remind you who they really are. And sometimes, that reminder comes with a price tag of $3.6 million.